All right, welcome everyone to another edition of the Subseasonal Forecast Contest. Today is June 2nd, and we'll be looking out to middle of June in today's forecast. We'll get to that in just a minute, but as usual, we're going to start today with our attribution. So we're going to look at in the past, and it was just brought to my attention. Some of you may see a little bit of a bug when you click on 512. If you're looking at the verification for 512, and it looks like one way to maybe try to get around that is to initially click on 55 and then scroll forward to the following week. But if that doesn't work, we're going to try to fix that here shortly. All right. Other than covering attribution, and we'll look again at the first couple of weeks of CDD forecasts that we have, and getting into today's forecast. Does anyone else have any agenda items that they would like us to cover in today's meeting? Since we don't have any special industry guests today, we have a little bit more time maybe at the end to cover any particular research topics if anyone has anything in mind.
You covered the Euro bias research last week, right?
That's right. That's right. We did a little bit. Michael Gruen gave us an update on that. So, well, think about it. If there's anything that comes to mind, just let us know. We can spend a little bit of time on that at the end. Okay, so I guess yeah, let's talk about attribution first. So our most recent verification is the week ending, or the 5-day period ending May 27th, May 31st. And looking at this period, let me sort it here. It looks like the verification was at 32 CDDs. So again, this is CDDs. And as a reference, the 10-year was about 30, and the 30-year CDDs is about 25 or 26 CDDs. So this was warmer, or a little bit above, or warmer than both the 10 and 30-year. And in terms of looking at the performance metrics, I guess we can look at the CRPS here. Matt Lanza was our leading performer here. You can see Matt performed so well for a couple of reasons. One, of course, his forecast mean was pretty close to what verified, 31, and what did we say verification was? 32, right? Yep. And his spread was very low, though. So it was, I guess you could say, a relatively high confidence forecast, because his spread was 4 versus some of these others. And he was rewarded in this case for that. So nice job to Matt. I don't think he's on the line, but nice job. And then on the other side of things, we had the numerical model guidance. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say. But I feel like we're kind of getting off to the same foot from last year with how some of this guidance is doing, especially in the summer. But the CFS, not a good forecast. I mean, what else can you say, right? The verification, or the forecast, was 18 CDDs, almost 18, and the verification was 32. The CEC was just a little bit better. So tough forecast from the numerical model guidance there. And let's take a look here. And of course, anyone can interject here, but I'll just go through a couple more things, and then we'll open up to everyone.
I actually have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did you mention that last summer you saw the kind of same trend with the models initially with the CDDs?
Yeah, I was thinking that. We could pull that up here real quick, the cooling season 2019. And we'll sort by performance. And you could see that the EC was here at -25, and the CFS was at -47. And you could see the bias here for the CFS in particular was 11. So just a really strong, in this case, that means it's a cold bias in the summer. So the CDDs were 11 CDD on average for each of those forecasts. On average, it was 11 CDDs below what verified.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, of all the forecasts last year that participated, at least, let's say, a third or half of the time, the CFS was the worst forecast. wasn't really that close. So yeah, so not often. And by the way, speaking of that, I know Zach mentioned that this in our weekly email. But if you'd like to look at a little some of the metrics in a little bit more detail, we did recently add the summer performance metrics. You can find that under the archive, and this will give you a little bit more information about not just last year, cooling season last year, 2018, but also we have 18, 17, 16, and I think 15. Just beware. We just posted these, so there there could be a typo or a bug, but I think everything's in order here. So
Dave,
yeah,
I just wanted to point out, especially in 2018 and 2019, Nick was asking if the models always start off performing that poorly, and you can see it last year and the year before. The red and blue lines are the models, and the black line is what was observed. So you can see how far below it was in both 2019 and 2018. 2017 looks like the EC had a little bit of a different performance in terms of that big dip in beginning of June. But yeah, if you want to look at that, Nick, that can give you a pretty good idea about how poorly the models can do sometimes.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And in this chart below, it provides the correlation. So it provides the value, but it also you have the scatter a scatter plot of all the points for the EC in blue, and the red is the CFS. So and the way to look at this is benchmarked to I think it's the 10-year anomaly. So basically, like with the CFS, it was consistently on the x-axis here. This is the forecast. The x-axis is the forecast. The y-axis is what was observed. So it was consistently forecasting about, in the area of -10, sometimes less than -10, sometimes -15, -20, sometimes, -5. But in general, it was forecasting a CDD anomaly in the ballpark of -10. That's this line right here. But then what verified is actually, now you have to look at the y-axis. And what verified, if you look on the y-axis, was of course something that was, kind of, if I had to pick a centering point, I'd probably say somewhere about +5, somewhere right on this y-axis here, somewhere up here. So that is another way where you can interpret that cold bias. It was forecasting -10, this vertical line, but it verified on somewhere on the horizontal here about +5. Consistent cold bias, very consistent cold bias. That's what shows up here. If there wasn't cold bias, it would look much more like the EC, or the EC has a much less pronounced bias for sure, because most of the forecast and verifications were closer to the zero lines. Does anyone have any question about how to read these charts or interpret these charts? We won't go through all of them today, but I just wanted to make sure you guys are aware of them and can utilize the information.
Not directly related, but sort of related, is I'm curious what the variance in the bias is, and not just the numbers. Now, based on these charts, it looks like the CFS bias variance is probably not that large, while the EC, it looks like if you're just taking a look at the numerical number for their bias, they probably have a larger variance to whatever bias it's in there.
And so I think this is a good, a little bit of a detour. Tell us, and me too, this is not just for other folks, tell me why you're interested in the variance of the bias. What is that? What information do you get by knowing that the variance is small, big, whatever?
Well, if I were trying to create, say, a very simple bias correction model, something that has a small variance in the bias means that I can probably just apply a single number and get away with it fairly consistently. But if there's a huge bias, like if there's a huge spread in whatever the variance is, say like one day it's -1 and another day it's -10, and it jumps around, even though it might center on one single average, but that means that if you're trying to apply a bias correction, just a very simple bias correction, you'll probably be more likely to be off.
So a lower variance in the bias would indicate a more consistent bias?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be, so would a bias like, well, I guess what you see here in the CFS, would that be, are you saying, would that be better or worse in terms of using a bias correction method? Would the bias correction significantly help? Or what situations will a bias correction better improve the scores?
I think it might actually make it, so perhaps if we had a bias corrected CFS, perhaps we would see something that was fairly consistent as reasonably good. But I guess we'd have to actually run the numbers to see what that looks like.
Right. Yeah. It does look like, and I'm saying this more just from an eyeball perspective, and part of this is obviously Monday morning quarterback knowing what we know now, but right, I mean, it does. I mean, I guess this might be an obvious statement, but yeah, applying that bias correction to this seems like it would improve the score significantly. Then again, this score is so atrocious, right? I mean, it's of anything is going to improve it. The correlation is minus 0.3. It's like, I mean, that's amazing to me that it's that bad.
Sort of reminds me when I think Mike was the one who mentioned it. Like if you had something called like an anti-CFS where you just forecasted the reverse number of HDDs or CDDs from the CFS and see how that would perform.
Yeah, no, I mean there's some we haven't productionized it yet, but there's some weighting schemes that Luke LaBelle helped develop some of this, and the weighting schemes actually apply a negative weighting to the CFS in order to improve the skill. So it's crazy. And just, I mean, since we're talking about just a quick glance across, here's the year before, so 2018. Actually, the EC was really bad, and the CFS was just plain bad. Year before that, not much better. Year before that, not much better. I mean, year before that, I guess you have to go to 2015, where the scores are at least positive in the 0.2s, and then back to bad again. So these summer scores, boy, right? They don't instill a lot of confidence, do they? That and just based on where we're started this year in the first two forecasts, again, it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in terms of utilizing the models to make a better forecast. So interesting what we're seeing there. So okay, well, I was just going to pull up the Maxar report so we can look back. So this is the Maxar report from May 12th. So verifying in our forecast window here, May 27th to May 31st. Maxar had 26 CDDs, which was pretty close. So Maxar kind of, even though this in some ways, these maps can be misleading. I don't know. I look at this map and it looks kind of warm to me, but their forecast in CDDs was pretty close to the 30-year normal and certainly cooler than the 10-year normal, right? And so, and then here's if you want to see what the verification looked like visually, here's kind of what it looked like. So there was actually a little bit more cool in Texas, but I guess a lot, I think it was spatially, and in particular in terms of intensity, some of these areas were much warmer. I mean, the West, I don't know if you guys can see it, but there's a widespread area of +10s. And then the Northeast, a lot of areas +5 to +10. And again, that worked out to about 32 CDDs. So the pattern certainly came a little bit warmer than expected. And let's just go back and look at the reading here real quick. They made a small cool change reflected in terms of angular momentum. The MJO is not a coherent signal, but some parameters suggest a weak tropical wave. Historically, a weak tropical wave making it toward the Western Hemisphere in the final days of the month historically, this is a cool signal for the eastern half and presents a risk to the forecast. So, yeah, obviously that doesn't always work out. Didn't work out this time. If anything, they were talking about some cooler risk to the forecast, maybe based on the MGO making it into phase 7. And the CFS covered some cool risk, so that just didn't verify. So let me just open it up here. And maybe as we do that, I'll pull up the 500 millibar hemispheric map. But does anyone have any thoughts here in terms of the forecast verification, in terms of telltale signs as to maybe why it verified on the warmer side, why some of the cool risks didn't verify, or any other data points about today's forecast or verification?
So
I think
I was going to say, go ahead, Phil. Sorry.
I was just reading that Maxar forecast. I think is rather interesting because if you look at what's going on right now, like today, we do indeed have an MJO signal in phase 1. And indeed right now, as you can probably feel, it's pretty cool outside. So it looks like to me, this was a case of they got the forecast right, but the timing was off.
Yeah, that's interesting. And let's pull up. That's an interesting way to look at it. And let's look at the. Just going to pull up the MJO just so everyone else can see. So we're definitely in phases. We've come through phases 8 and 1 now in the last few days. I do want to look at one data point though. Here was I was cheating and looking at this earlier. So here's the forecast for the next 5 days. So if I was, in some respects, I agree with what Philip suggests. In some respects, if I was playing contrarian here or jerk, I might. So just a review of what we're looking at. This is over here is the EC ensemble, last several EC ensemble runs. Over here is the Maxar forecast, and it's color coded. And here are the dates. So today, tomorrow, and so on. And these are the CDDs. So this is what we're forecasting, but we aggregate up on 5-day periods. And this is looking at the CDD daily forecast the next 15 days, right? Color coded by above and below normal. So the next few days, at least, look to be pretty warm again. So to Philip's point, if they were right, it was sort of just a real brief shot, right, in between, because obviously it was warm for that 5-day period that ended yesterday. And it's kind of getting back warm again for the next 5 days. On the flip side, it looks like after the next 5 days, if you believe some of this guidance, and the EC is cooler than the Maxar forecast. You can see that here, the blues. It does look like we're trying to get into a less warm pattern, or maybe a cool pattern if you believe the EC ensemble. So to Philip's point here, maybe that MJO was a sign of trying to break down, getting to a cooler pattern, but the timing or what have you was off a little bit. So anyway, just some 2 cents. But Joe, did you also have a thought on this?
Well, for our forecast, we were looking at 22, and it looked like if you go to the Maxar Dynacast, it looks like I was maybe off by 2 days on the placement, because I was saying that a Great Lakes Northeast trough was coming back, and that trough came back on the 30th.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was our mentality, and I was, the SR and the analogs both showed the Northeast and the Great Lakes trough returning, and like I said, it looked like it came back late on the 29th.
Yeah, this that brings up an issue. I mean, I feel like both Philip and Joe have kind of touched on this. So timing of synoptic-like events in the 16 to 20 can be daunting, right? It can be a daunting task, and even if you're off by a couple days, you can miss a forecast badly in terms of CDD.
Yeah, because of the prefrontal warming was huge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. So, we've talked to Dave Dargangelo a little bit about that too. I'm not sure if he's on the line right now. I don't think he is, but you know, and it's like, how do you deal with those kinds of situations where, um, you know, you're trying to time things at a synoptic level, but, you know, 20 days out, or, and I think one of the things that came up too was that if you just generally think that you're going into a cold pattern, but you don't know exactly, and you know there's going to be some up and down, you probably are going to lean in that cool direction, because at the end of the day, again, if you're right and you go into that cool pattern, sure, you're going to have some 2 or 4 day blips, but overall, you're going to get the macro pattern right. And that's probably the more important data point for your users. At least that's a perspective. I think that's one perspective on it. So cool. Okay.
Dave, one more thing I wanted to add. Could you go back to the verification map?
This one? Oh, or you mean the
Dynacast one? Yeah, for the US.
Ooh, sorry.
That's all right.
That's temperature, by the way, if you want to see temperature. There you go.
Yeah, so like I look at this map and then I look at what Maxar produced, and from a pattern perspective, it seems like they were pretty accurate in terms of getting that swath of, you know, normal to below normal temperatures right through the center of the country, and then having the warmth on both sides. So from like a pattern perspective, I guess you can say Maxar had a good forecast, but they were off by, you know, 6 or 7 CDDs. And, you know, when we're still at these low values, that's a pretty significant amount. So like, would a trader consider that a good forecast? Like, do they care more about the number, or that you're getting the pattern, a bit of both? Like, what would this be deemed a good forecast?
I mean, I think it could be a little bit of both. I mean, at the end of the day, though, I mean, a trader who is looking at national demand, I mean, you know, it's what's the saying about close only counts and horseshoes and hand grenades or whatever. You know, they're gonna get burned, right? I mean, so if they had a trade that accounted for, that was, you know, there was an expectation for a certain type of, you know, CDD or HDD count, and it's not there. It really doesn't matter why it's not there or how, or if it was just bad luck or whatever. You know, the trade's not going to work, right? So they could lose a lot of money. So yeah, would they be unhappy? Sure, because of that. But I do think that a good trader will also recognize when it's just, a good trader can sometimes recognize, I think, when it's bad luck versus just, you know, not a good forecast. And so I think, and that's, I think it's up to a little bit the meteorologist or the analyst to communicate that, and kind of do what we're doing a little bit in terms of the attribution. Like, okay, my CDD forecast was off by 10. Here's why I think it was off by 10. You know, either because the pattern just completely did something I didn't expect. You know, I thought the MJ was going to be weak. It was strong. It ended up creating a much different pattern than I expected. All right, that's like a complete miss. Versus, I think what you're saying, and maybe Philip and Joe have said a little bit, which is, you know what, like by and large, that we had the pattern right. It just was, the trough was, you know, 300 miles to the west, but that 300 miles can create a big error in the forecast. Yeah. Does that help, Zach? I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to just get your subjective answer on that kind of thing, just so I can know in the future what a good forecast would look like.
I really believe, I mean, just to emphasize this again, this is why attribution is so important, because you want to understand what it was, and even just to handle these situations better, right? And not that you and I and all of us in the car are going to walk away from this call feeling fulfilled, because a lot of times you're not. It's just the way weather is, right? Like, oh, now I know all the answers. No, but at least, you know, and part of it is that the fact that you know how difficult these situations are, right? Again, this is where, you know, and I think this helps us as we think about better risk assessment too, like in providing, you know, confidence around our forecasts and stuff. Because if we know that just a relatively small change, like a change in terms of the spatial pattern, you know, we talk about this a lot in terms of when there's gradients, and like if we're expecting a gradient, and arguably, you know, well, I don't know if this fits into that one scenario, But we've talked about scenarios where, hey, if there's a gradient near major metropolitan areas, like let's say in the I-80 corridor, even an error in our forecast that's relatively small relative to what errors typically are 16 to 20 days from now can create a major error in terms of the prediction that we're interested in, HDDs, CDDs. So again, the modelers could come back and say, oh, wow, the correlation in this forecast was actually very good. It was 0.8, or the 500 millibar height error was actually in a small percentile, like it was it was small, but it could still result in big HDD and CD errors. And that's where you have to you have to know both sides of it, right? You have to know the academic side of it and what typical model errors are, but then you have to also understand your region of sensitivity, and because those could be two different things. Yeah. Any other, I don't know, I know we spent a little bit of time on this, but I think it's an interesting topic. Any other thoughts on the forecast here before we move on? Okay. All right. So let's move on to the current forecast, right? So today's what, the 2nd? All right. So again, we're forecasting June 2nd. So we're forecasting out, hard to believe, but out to the middle end of June here, June 17th, June 21st. Let me do a quick sort, and then we'll just kind of open it up. By the way, there's a 0 for industry here. It's because I had to actually do this pretty early this morning, and I ran some of the stuff, and I didn't realize that they hadn't put out their forecast yet. So I will update that at some point, but that's why. All right, so let's look at the range here. So at the hot end of things, we've got Paul Roundy, who's up near 50 CDDs, and the 5-year average is up there too. And on the cool end, we've got, no surprise, we've got the CFS, which was around 35 CDD, so about a 15 CDD range. And just as a reference, where's the 30 and 10 year? The 30 year is about 41, and the 10 year is about 46. So, we've got definitely some forecasts that are warmer than the 10 and 30 year, and we've got some forecasts on the cooler end of things. We've got some interesting spreads. Matt Lanza seems like, yeah, he's got a low one. It seems like Matt tends to be on the lower side. And we've got Philip actually is on the lower side too. And then look at that, Zach and Philip. That'll be interesting to hear about this. Their means are almost identical, but Philip's going to do a lot better if it verifies around 47, but Zach will do better if it verifies further away from 47. So we'll see. But all right, with that, let's see. Let's open it up. Who'd like to go first?
I can volunteer as tribute if no one else wants to go.
All right, that's Michael. Thank you, Michael. And if anyone would like to scream, please let me know.
All right, so my forecast was 48.6 CDDs with an average spread of 8.4. Small change to the formula this week, reduced the teleconnections weighting by 10% and increased the CPC weighting by 10% to account for the fact that this week the teleconnections weren't really giving me a very strong signal. So I wasn't feeling too confident in that, so I reduced them by a little bit. Overall, though, since I mentioned teleconnections, the NAO spread is still kind of all over the place, and going with a midpoint gets you a neutral NAO. The AO is running slightly negative, so slightly cooler signal, but not sure if that'll be able to really influence the pattern too much. P&A looking to be around neutral to maybe slightly negative, but again, nothing that really looks to be influencing or changing the regime we're in right now. EPO, same deal. I think slightly positive. It's predicted to be towards that period, as you can see. But again, that's pretty weak if it even ends up positive. So again, nothing that I expect to be able to change the pattern we're in. The CPC shows warmth pretty much everywhere except for I think North Dakota. If I'm just wait a second here. If it lets you in.
Get down there. There we go.
Yeah, so basically, north central U.S. is the only area that looks to be below average, and nobody really lives there. So it won't really do much to the CDDs, but places like Texas, Florida, Georgia, all 55% chance above average. So that's a pretty strong signal. Most of the country is above average anyway. And if I'm reading this correctly, maybe New York. I'm not sure if that's 55 or 50. It's kind of hard to tell since there's two 55s in the middle of the country. So maybe it's 50. I'm going to go with 50. But yeah, so pretty warm signal from the CPC, and they did reasonably well last year. If I remember Dr. Decker's score from last year, I think he did reasonably well using the CPC. So increased them to 40% based off of that. And yeah, that's pretty much my forecast. Any questions, complaints, comments, concerns?
Well, I was just going to say that I think you brought up a good point. This is not a question, I guess, but we were talking a lot about gradients and stuff. This is, I mean, exactly what you said, but just to emphasize it, this would hit all the sweet spots in terms of CDDs, right? Yeah, there's not much population up here, and there's not much CDD production at this time of year. But the Southwest, the Southeast, Texas, Mid-Atlantic, Philadelphia, DC, all those areas. I mean, so this is like a perfect spatial map for CDDs. And I feel like it's not super sensitive to change. In other words, obviously if it's 180, but if it moves over a couple hundred miles, okay, let's say Denver gets into the cool. Again, not a huge production area. Let's say Chicago gets into the cool. Again, not a huge production area. Really, unless this below hits like Atlanta, DC, so you have some wiggle room here. I'm not, I guess I'm just, again, I guess I'm speaking to that whole confidence issue. Like maybe there's a way to interpret this as if you believe this to be right, or at least close, that this could be construed as a high confidence forecast, because even if it's off a little bit spatially, it could still, I think this pattern would be resilient to significant changes in CDDs. So just a thought there. Michael, I will ask you one client question. How would you answer the question if someone said, if I said to you, hey, Mike, I've seen the EC and CFS have been pretty crappy the first couple of weeks. How much weight? Should I dismiss them completely? How should I utilize the EC and CFS going forward?
Well, the way I'll answer both of that question a little bit separately. CFS first. CFS, I would, as Phil mentioned earlier, I'm a strong proponent of the anti-CFS weighting. So basically, whatever the CFS says, do the opposite. And based on the directional correctness that we have from, I think, both the HDD and CDD seasons of the past year, you'll do reasonably well with that. So CFS says cool, so I say warm. So that's how I would use the CFS. The EC, a bit harder to nail down a bias. I think I mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. The EC bias, based on my research, is fairly inconsistent. Usually can vary from week to week. Not wildly, but I've seen it get pretty bad misses, and But at any rate, so the EC, usually I have the best success when it's, and this might be a bit subjective, but I've seen the EC have its best success when it's near the 10-year, and I think that's especially true during the CDD season when the 10-year is usually our best performer. So this particular week, I would say the CFS is probably in the ballpark, so you could use it. But that would change on a week-to-week basis depending on what the EC is showing, at least in my opinion.
So, and let's stay on this. Let's do client, customer. I don't have a lot of time. So boil that down again for me. Bottom line is,
basically use the opposite of what the CFS says. If it says cold, go warmer. It's probably going to be warmer. If it says warm, it's probably going to be a little cooler.
Okay.
And the EC, when it's near the 10-year, I think it does reasonably well. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to say, but you have to look at what the EC is showing on a week-to-week basis. But if it's near the CFS, you probably want to stay away from the EC that week.
Okay, so how come you didn't weight it in today's forecast then? Because it's near the 10-year.
Since it's so close to the 10-year, I was already more or less weighted in since I used the 10-year as a baseline. I was actually, this isn't really part of my answer, but I just want to mention this. I was going to put in one of my bias corrections, the one that I think I mentioned last week was doing well. I was going to use that, but then I looked at where the EC and 10-year were and realized that I'll end up with the exact same forecast because the 10-year and the EC weighting, that's what the bias correction uses. So I just was kind of thinking, it's like, I'll wait till they're a little bit further apart. If that makes sense.
Well, let's come back to that issue. Let's come back to that in maybe later. But I just want to make sure I understand again. With my client hat on, you're telling me you didn't weight the EC today because you already weighted the 10-year, but the 10-year is only weighted 10%. So I mean, yeah. So I'm still, as a client, I guess I'm still a little confused in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of wrote, that's my formula. I don't put a lot of weight on modeling or really the 10-year or 30-year average, depending on the season. So that's just kind of a product of my formula. If someone did use the models more, they could have put a higher weight on the EC today than I think.
Okay. All right, that's a better. Okay, I think I understand what you're saying now. You're saying to me, listen, I normally I don't use the EC as a general rule. Period. However, in observation, I think it does perform a little bit better when it's closer to the 10-year. I still don't explicitly weight. I don't change my weighting formula as a function of that, but it is an observation that, hey, in this situation, it might do a little bit better than it would if it were whatever close to the CFS or something.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Any other questions for Michael? All right. Who would like to go next?
I guess
I can go. Oh, you can go,
wanna
Philip.
then?
Philip? Is that Philip? Well, we'll do Philip.
All right. Now, before I go into my forecast, I just wanted to say something that was rather funny, which is if we look at the MJO right now in phase 1, and I wrote in that the forecasts differ on the speed of propagation, with some models looping the index from phase 2 back to phase 1 and others pushing to phase 3. While I was writing that, I couldn't help but think that I was actually writing a forecast for when states will be reopening in different phases. But
That's fun.
But anyway, going back to my forecast.
Yeah.
So we know that using the same weighting that I used last week, if we look at the tropics, it looks like when we look at the current MJO signal and its evolution, putting together the lag composite and also the MJO analog, I treated that as a slightly warm signal with a chance for a warmer east and maybe a slightly cooler west, and that results in a warm signal. And then the CPC, as was already mentioned, was basically warm for the entire CONUS. And when I read the CPC forecast, the wording seemed to imply slightly higher confidence on their part. So I treated that as a very warm signal. The teleconnections, as was mentioned, there's a wide spread in the forecasts with slightly favored negative AO and AO. And during this time of year, as we move into summer, the NAO signal tends to reverse from what it usually means in the winter. So a slightly negative NAO would be a slightly positive temperature signal. And then finally, when we look at the EC, I thought it was interesting that the EC 500 millibar heights show a strengthening ridge over much of North America. And in fact, if you click on Northern Hemisphere, it looks like almost the entire Northern Hemisphere has above average heights. The less consistent CFS also favors higher heights in the west and eastern sides of the US. And the EC is also a warm signal, even though I only weighted 5%. And looking at confidence, it seems like all the different parameters are all above average. And if we look at the climatological indices, once again, you see the progressively higher numbers for shorter periods with the smaller sigmas. So I reduced my sigma by a lot, and we'll see what happens.
Any questions? Philip? Okay. All right. Zach, you want to give it a whirl?
Yeah, I'll go next since Philip and I had a pretty similar forecast in terms of our mean this week. So I kept my formula the same as last week. Haven't had enough verifications to truly test if it's a viable formula for this summer. As I mentioned last week, it worked decently well in terms of how I did compared to everybody else last summer, but we'll see for this summer. Either way, my values for this week were 47 for the mean and 8.4 normal spread. As Philip mentioned, there was a lot of warmth in the EC in the 16 to 20 and leading up to that period. Pretty much the entire country was covered in above average 500 millibar heights. The CFS, again, was showing something similar on the coasts, lots of above average heights on both the east and west coast, but kind of very similar to the CPC, a bit of cold starting to dip into the north central part of the country in the Dakotas. So that's really the only potential risk I saw in a forecast that I would consider having a warm skew, without doubt. But because the CFS has performed so poorly so far, I wasn't quite sure how to interpret a map with the chance for some cold to spread into, some of those high demand areas like Chicago potentially. So I just ended up keeping my spread at normal rather than shifting it to a higher confidence forecast. Plus, I'm always hesitant to make a high confidence forecast in the first place, even if all the signals are pointing to a consistent pattern.
Okay. Any questions for Zach? I'm trying to think of something, but it's hard because, you bring up the point that last year, if we look at last year, we don't have to do that, but yeah, I think the 10-year normal and was a very, very good forecast. It worked out like to be one of the, if not one of the top forecasts. And I think, your methodology included a lot of that. And I think you did well. It brings me back to like this question about like, when do you can you, and the dynamic guidance is so bad, right? At least it has been in previous years. It's not off to a good start this year. How do you, we know there's going to be a few of these, and maybe this is a question for you. I don't think it's easy, but I don't know. We know there's going to be a few of these synoptic, even if this is a hot summer or relatively hot, there's going to be a few synoptic cool patterns. Do we have any hope, Zach, of identifying these events, 15, 20 days in advance? Or is it just going to be one of those things where we're just going to have to swallow the pill and know that there's going to be a few of those we're going to miss? What says you?
That's a tough question. I think there's enough metrics and there's enough, personal opinion spread across this table that I think some of these synoptic cool patterns could be predicted, but I would not say that we get them all. So I'd say, sometimes we'd have to, swallow the pill. Sometimes I think we'd be able to get it. There's a lot of information here. And, this week, you've seen that the CFS is the only forecast. We can't see the industry forecast, but the CFS is the only forecast that's predicting below the 30-year temperature-wise. Doesn't seem like this week would be the week, but fairly consistently, there's a pretty decent amount of forecasts on either side of the 30-year normal. So I'd say that there's some times where, listening to someone or looking at some of these metrics will help you predict some of these cool patterns, but, it's not going to be consistent at all.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess that brings up one idea, I guess. I mean, it could be a study and it could also be a skill metric, I guess, like some sort of detection rate. Like it would be interesting to look back at the past X years, 5, 6, whatever years we have, and to be able to investigate that question a little bit more from a perspective of, I guess I'd start with, the numerical models, and then maybe there's a way to look at it in terms of AO, or some other teleconnection, but basically to say, if these were our 3 inputs that we used every day, would they give us any evidence, heads up about a potential, in this case, we're talking about cold pattern. So cold pattern shift or cold pattern 15 to 20 days out. I'd be interested to see how often in the last 5 years, EC, CFS, or some of these other data points, AO, whatever you want to call it, would have given us some advance notice. Because then we could at least feel more secure about the answer to that question. The answer may not be very pleasing in the sense that it could come back and say that, yeah, the EC never, or 2% of the time, but maybe not. And regardless, it would be helpful to have that, to know what that answer is, Just a thought. Okay. Any other questions or comments for Zach on his forecast?
Yes, sort of another answer that addresses the question that you asked him. I was just taking a look at if we go to, you don't have to click it, but I was looking at the summary for all weeks, and there you can see what the directionally correct percentage for the cooling season is. And I did a quick comparison of all the forecasts that had like a reasonable number, say over 12 forecasts or so. And it's very interesting because the 10-year normal was directionally correct about 83% of the time. And if you look at all the human forecasters who made over, say, 15 forecasts, nearly all of them are directionally correct between, say, 75 to 85%, which means everyone's clustering for directionally correct in the cooling season. But it's very similar to what the 10-year normal was.
Yeah. And that, right, that sort of brings up, it is funny because there was a discussion about this on the Albany, I don't know if anyone's on the Albany map discussion, but it's an email thread. And it was a few weeks ago, they were talking about basically like something analogous is about like what is climatology a forecast? Is normal forecast like if you just use a 10-year normal and stuff like that. But, I guess, yeah, in the summer, I think we talked about this last year. I think a lot of, we saw the signs, right? That, hey, the 10-year normal normally beats the 30-year in the summer, right? There's a stronger trend, whatever it is in the summer. And we gravitated to that. And because of that, we were rewarded directionally. But then the next question is, can you beat the 10-year normal? Can you actually add value beyond the 10-year normal? I think that's one question, or something close to the 10-year normal trend, whatever. And question two, can you identify those instances when the 10-year normal fails? It's significant. Those few instances, right? If we go, what was the chart we were looking at? I guess this one, right? Let's look at last year. Like, there weren't a lot of instances, but in particular, I guess here was one instance in July, sometime July, where everything came in below the 10 and 30-year. And then there was another instance here in August, right, where we came in below. So honestly, there were only like really two in this period that like fell below the 30-year. I don't know. Am I missing something here? A couple, yeah. Is there a way to capture that kind of stuff? Do you have any thoughts on that, Philip? I think, I guess we're almost out of time here. Yeah, do you have any quick thoughts on that? And then we can move on to any final thoughts from folks.
Yes, that was also the struggle for me last year, because I remember getting a little frustrated when every time we saw the 10-year come up with a nicer score than every human forecaster, and just seemed impossible to beat. And then a handful of times where then we overweighted the 10-year for those two forecasts and then got harshly penalized.
Right. Yeah, so it sounds like no easy answers, right? Is kind of what you're saying. I mean, yeah. I actually remember now. Now I kind of remember this. I don't even want to look at the skill scores, but this period in late summer, I think, where we had that one blip of cool, and then the models really kind of went for it. Obviously, especially the CFS went really. It was late to the game, but then it went for it, and then it was wrong. It's just like the observation in black here. After that brief cool blip, went back warm again. So anyway. Let's see. I know we only have a couple minutes, but Joe, are you still on the line here? Would you like to give your forecast? If you're on the line?
No, he left.
Oh, he left. Sorry. Anyway, I think we covered everyone else.
I'll give mine.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Nick. Right?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's okay. Just kind of to piggyback on the 10-year discussion. That was kind of the first thing I noticed when I was looking at the Maxar data, is that over the last 10 years, 8 of the 10 CDDs for this period were very high, they were all above 49. So I think that kind of plays a huge influence onto, obviously that's much higher than the 30-year. So I think that carried a huge influence, and that kind of skewed my forecast. I gave a lot of stock into the fact that maybe that's the new normal. Maybe that trend is continuing. So I diluted it a little bit with the 30-year normal, but that was really the major kind of sticking point for me, was taking that and then keeping that in mind, looking at the CFS, the Euro, and the CPC outlook. They indicated some warning to even a little bit more warming on the Euro. So I leaned more into the idea that we're going to have closer to above normal CDDs for this period.
Yeah. It's hard to fight the trend. It's hard to fight that in the summer, Any questions for Nick before we close it out? I know we're just about out of time.
No, I just wanted to say to Nick, I mean, that's great that you're making forecasts. I hope it's a valuable experience, but get ready to be frustrated, because this is not an easy thing to do. So hope you're prepared for that.
Yeah, I can already see that it's when I submitted, I was like, wow, this feels like a shot in the dark. I mean, I have a lot of information to work off of, but still.
Yeah, great work, Nick, getting involved here so quickly. Yeah, the only other thing that comes to mind in terms of potential research ideas, it's always, I know this kind of is it maybe a little bit more of an old school thing, but you could like look at all the cold events, right, over the last 5-10 years and try to find consistent themes in those, right? Like you could look at some of these variables and say what of the whatever 20 cold events, what percentage were associated with MGO phase 6, what percent were associated with AO negative, what percent were associated with whatever. Perhaps some of those things could give you some information too. I guess you don't know until you look at it. So, all right. Anyone have any final thoughts before we close it out? All right. So thank you, everyone. And let's see. Next week, Zach. I think next week we're going to be on for Friday's schedule, right?
Yeah, we're going to be on Friday, 9:30 to 10:30, and Dr. Trabacchino is going to be our special guest.
Yeah, we have a couple special guests coming up here. So next Friday with Lynn Trabacchino. And then I think the following week on Tuesday, we're going to have another special guest, Joe Bastardi, who has many, many, many years of experience in subseasonal forecasting. So that's also exciting. So, all right, well, we'll send out more information. And thanks for everyone for participating. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Hey, everybody.
Bye.